Hey YouTubers, this is the Gold Standard Caesar 924 coming at you with another video for you guys today. So with Halloween coming around the corner, I figured I'd crank up at least one or two videos to kind of coincide with this year's festivities. And I actually recently rewatched this pay-per-view a few days ago. It's just astounding just to see just how much happened during this event. And a lot of it wasn't for the better, unfortunately, and I'll get a little more into that as the video rolls along. Now, as the title, you could look up at the title of the screen. This is going to be my review, or sort of a retrospective look on the annual WCW pay-per-view event held every October, that being Halloween Havoc 1998. Now, the pay-per-view was held in the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada. It was a venue where WCW will hold their annual Halloween Havoc events for many years up in this point. 98 was no exception. Now, the match, as far as the matchups go, you had the anticipated main event between Goldberg defending his WCW World Championship against Diamond Dallas Page, who had won the three-way or the three-team War Games match from the previous pay-per-view being Fall Brawl, allowing Page to earn that number one contendership against then champion Goldberg at the upcoming Halloween Havoc event. Now, I'll get a little more into that also as the video rolls along, but the first match that opened up the show was for the WCW World Television Championship. We have Chris Jericho defending the belt against Raven. Now, this was just about a month after the dissolution of Raven's flock. He had this feud going on with Perry Saturn, where if Saturn won, then the flock would permanently disband altogether, but if Raven won, then Saturn would remain with the flock. Saturn would eventually win that match at Fall Brawl against Raven and causing the flock to dissolve altogether. So Raven's basically a man without a country at this point. Aside from Chris Kanyon, this was a match that didn't really have a whole lot of build-up. Chris Jericho was also coming out of a pretty hot year as well as one of the longest running cruiserweight champions, and he'd been holding the belt for a good portion of 1998, and he had that classic feud with Dean Malenko. Once he lost the cruiserweight title at Road Wild, he would go on to move on to bigger things. He would go on to win the television title, and so he would carry that television title into Halloween Havoc by challenging Raven. Yeah, this is actually a really fun match, and it's very interesting because the fact that Jericho and Raven were both wrestling as heels, even though they did have a couple promos before the match where Jericho just started to really catch fire with the fans. The fans started to really gravitate towards Jericho despite being a heel. Sort of kind of like the prototype to his eventual babyface run that he would have when he got to the WWE. Yeah, they had a really good to great match here, a great way to open up the show, as a matter of fact. We did see a bit of interference from Kanyon, who came out there to help Raven, but that backfires. There was a couple counters where Jericho tries to, go for the walls of Jericho, or at the time that he was in WCW, it was the Lion Tamer. There were some instances where Raven managed to get a hold of the rope. Raven tried to go for his even flow DDT, only for Jericho to reverse into another attempt at the Lion Tamer in order to successfully retain the TV title. This was a really great match, and I mean, it wasn't very long. I mean, it was only like under 8 to 10 minutes or so. It was like 7 minutes to be exact, according to Wikipedia. I mean, it did feel like it was given a reasonable amount of time, and it was actually a really fun way to open up the show. I mean, you look at the Halloween Havoc card on paper, and it looks like it could have been a pretty promising pay-per-view event, and it was very stacked. The first match that opened up the show, I mean, really showed how much promise this show was going to be. And it does, unfortunately, get downhill as the pay-per-view continues along. The first match on the show just showed just how this pay-per-view came off to a strong start. And so Jericho would go over Raven, and he would successfully retain his belt. Jericho would continue holding that belt until Starrcade, where he lost it to Conan. And then afterwards, Jericho just kind of had this little beef going on with Perry Saturn, and then eventually, he left WCW to go to the WWE. Jericho was really red hot in 1998. He didn't even have to align himself with the NWO in order to get over. And I think that's kind of looking in hindsight or retrospective. I mean, it's just amazing just to see how effective Jericho's character was, and it's like this cocky and brash character that's just all full of himself. Some of the promos that he was cutting during that time, like he was cutting on Malenko's, like he has a lot more submission holds that Malenko has. Like he would come out with like his own merchandise where he claims himself to be the man of 1,004 holds. So there's actually a lot of cool stuff that Jericho did, and he did make the most of his run in WCW despite some shortcomings towards the end. It would definitely be a sign of things to come for him once he transitions over from that company over to the WWE. And then we get a couple other matches that don't really amount to anything. There was a match between Wrath and Ming, which was a match that lasted under 5 minutes. So Ming was part of the Dungeon of Doom, and then that stable split up. So, Ming and Barbarian were a team for a while. Wrath was just starting to really catch fire with the fans and starting this sort of undefeated streak. I mean, I know Wrath was actually pretty over watching some old Nitro matches that Wrath had, and most of them were squash matches. He just had this sort of like certain mystique and aura about him that just make it seem like, yeah, that maybe this guy does have what it takes to, potentially be one of the top dogs in WCW. I haven't seen much of his stuff that he was in WWE when he was Atom Bomb, but I definitely like what I've seen here in WCW, and it's very a shame that his push got pulled off the rug as far as momentum was concerned. I mean, he and Goldberg had this undefeated streak, and Wrath was kind of another wrestler that was kind of going through that sort of like this Goldberg kind of rise to the top, and he was just squashing people left and right. So the match didn't last very long. Wrath just completely decimates Ming with the meltdown, that pump handle slam that he would do in order to get the victory. So, I mean, the match wasn't really a whole lot to make note about. Yeah, Wrath was definitely really getting over hot, and it's definitely a shame that they never really did much with them. Like once like Kevin Nash defeated Wrath and his whole undefeated streak, so he definitely wasn't the same after that. And then we have another match, which out of all the filler matches in between, I guess I could give this the benefit of the doubt, because this was going to be a match to determine the number one contender for a match to challenge Billy Kidman, who was the Cruiserweight champion that was scheduled to compete in this show. So this would be a match between Disco Inferno and Juventud Guerrero. Juventud was also another guy that was really coming to his own in the Cruiserweight division. Earlier that year, he had his mask removed after coming up short in a match against Chris Jericho. And Guerrero was, coming off red hot. He was winning matches. He was holding the Cruiserweight title a few times, and then eventually losing it to Billy Kidman. Now, Disco Inferno, he was more of a sports entertainer gimmick. I mean, he wasn't like the kind of guy where you expect, oh yeah, this guy could do like a bunch of flippy floppy high spots, like Juventud is most known for. But he's not like the first wrestler you would think of that comes to mind when you think of like cruiserweight wrestling. So Disco Inferno, it wasn't that bad of a match, but it did its job. He did go over Juventud shockingly. It's not like Disco was a complete jobber at the same time either. He had already held the television title the year before. So Disco did win in this match, and then we also have another match that, like Wrath and Ming, that doesn't really amount to anything. Alex Wright did go over Fit Finlay there, so it's not really a whole lot to talk about. Same with Saturn and Lodi. This is basically sort of a continuation of Saturn and the Flock, and even though the Flock had already disbanded by this point, yeah, Saturn was just coming in as a babyface and continuing his stride by defeating one of the leftovers of the Flock members and basically squashing Lodi in the process. So Disco and Billy Kidman would eventually have their match later that night. Kidman would go over as the Cruiserweight champion. Looking back at some of Billy Kidman's matches, they don't, like, a lot of people don't give him a lot of credit. I know people remember Billy Kidman for that for his run in WWE, and basically that spot that almost ended the career of Chavo Guerrero when he unintentionally botched the shooting star press and accidentally landed his knee onto the neck of Chavo. I mean, if you look at some of his run in WCW, I mean, Kidman was also another one of those cruiserweight wrestlers. I don't think gets a whole lot of credit when compared to other top echelon cruiserweight wrestlers from that from that era. Really looking back at some of the later WCW half, Kidman actually had something special to him. And it goes to show just how over Billy Kidman was and how he was starting to catch fire once he started to, break away from the flock and he started turning babyface. He would go over Disco and successfully retain the Cruiserweight title. And then we also have another match, and this involves the World Tag titles involving the Giant and Scott Steiner, who at this point, this was basically NWO Hollywood. So they were basically defending the belts against Rick Steiner and Buff Bagwell. Now, Scott and Rick, basically, they were the Steiner brothers. I mean, they were multiple-time tag team champions. And earlier that year, Scott turned on his brother Rick at Super Brawl and joined the NWO. In the process, he started having this new makeover. He started sporting the white singlet, the white bleach blonde haircut that he would have, and dubbing himself Big Papa Pump. So this was also an ongoing saga that was going on throughout the year of whether or not Rick and Scott are going to have have an actual one-on-one match, because they kind of postponed it throughout a good portion of '98. A lot of the times where the match is scheduled to take place, a lot of the times it doesn't. So after months and months and months and months of anticipation, so we do get this match at Halloween Havoc. And the stipulation is that if Rick Steiner and a partner of his choosing would win the match and the tag titles, then Rick would get a chance to have a match against Scott Steiner. So Rick and Buff do, however, go over Giant and Scott Steiner in this match. Now, I also almost forgot to mention about this. Buff Bagwell also was part of the NWO going in this event until a neck injury had him shelved off TV for a few short months. Buff Bagwell was kicked out of the NWO, and so Buff being kind of looked at as like this weak link of the NWO, that he was kind of like this liability. And there was actually a segment on Nitro, and I think like Hulk Hogan knocked Buff Bagwell off of a wheelchair, and it drew like a lot of massive heel heat for the NWO and especially Hogan. People started rallying towards Bagwell. I mean, Bagwell's definitely also another guy that was pretty hot during that time. And even going to this event, it's like, that Bagwell's going to come back as this kind of like this hero, and he's going to atone or at least come back and vow for his revenge against the guys that betrayed him and whatnot. Unfortunately, there was going to be a bit of a swerve. It was pretty stupid towards the end, because Rick and Scott do have the match, and everything seems all fine and fair. And the match doesn't last long. Rick did, however, defeat Scott Steiner. Bagwell just turns on Rick Steiner despite winning the tag titles. And then the belts were vacant for several months, and then they did like a tournament in '99. Alright, so next up we have is the first out of the 4 marquee matches featured on the card. And this is a match between former NWO members, former outsiders, Scott Hall versus Kevin Nash. Now, this had been built up for a good portion of the summer of 1998. And this kind of harkens back to earlier that spring, when Hogan and Kevin Nash started to sever ties. And so, as a result, you have these two wrestlers forming their own respective factions. So, Kevin Nash had the NWO Wolfpack. Hulk Hogan maintained the original NWO with NWO Hollywood. So, Nash with the Wolfpack sports the black and red NWO logo. Hulk Hogan would maintain the NWO trademarks that had already been established prior to the split. Scott Hall eventually turns on Kevin Nash at Slamboree, and there's some back and forth going on between Wolfpack and Hollywood. So Hall's now siding with Hogan, and NWO Hollywood, while Kevin Nash is leading his own faction. So they've been kind of going back and forth between the two factions throughout the summer and even segging way into the early autumn of 1998. And the build-up, I was watching some Nitro episodes leading into the show, and there was actually some pretty cool moments that were featured in the weeks leading in this pay-per-view, where he would have like the Wolfpack members attack NWO Hollywood. There would always be like these backstage brawls, and there was like a Nitro where the Wolfpack members spent most of the night searching for Scott Hall. And there was like a moment where I believe I think it might have been Sting, or it was one of the Wolfpack guys, and they like lifted a forklift and they just dropped with the limousine. There was actually a spot there where they just tilt over a limousine or one of the vehicles that the NWO were driving. I'm pretty sure it's a limousine. Kevin Nash and Hall had their own beef that leads into this pay-per-view. In the match, it wasn't as on par compared to some of the matches that they had in WWE, especially the match that they had at SummerSlam 94. But, this was more of a personal rivalry as opposed to just two men just squaring off to see who the better wrestler is. But this was kind of more of a personal heated rivalry of betrayal and vowing revenge. Scott Hall started off the match and basically choking out Kevin Nash. Eventually, Nash would fight back. And basically, the match ended where he just gives Scott Hall like multiple jackknife power bombs. And then rather than having to pin his opponent, Nash just decides to just walk away. So Scott Hall would win via countout. Rivalry sort of continued a little bit. They were supposed to have a match at World War III that wasn't really a match, and then they did this whole angle where Scott Hall was kicked out of the NWO, and then he became like the lone wolf, and then they spent most of the tail end of '98 leading into that Goldberg Nash rivalry, where Scott Hall's allegiance, whether or not he would be on good terms with Kevin Nash once again. And little did we do realize that the 6-7 months of the Wolfpack and the Hollywood members of the NWO just going at it was just all meant for nothing when they ended up reuniting, and the rest of the story there. This match just was what it was. It wasn't anything too memorable. Then we also have Sting versus Bret Hart. This was for the WCW United States Championship. I think this match should have been a lot better than it actually was. Thinking about the star power that these two wrestlers had. And, Sting the previous year was the guy for WCW that was going to be kind of like that conquering hero that's going to slay the dragon, that's going to, put an end to the NWO. And, we saw at Starrcade 97 where Sting and Hogan took place. Sting won the match under some dubious circumstances. Bret Hart, who was just making his WCW debut after the Montreal Screwjob. So there were some weird circumstances going on in that match, as far as the false finishes and having to restart the match under Bret Hart's officiating. And even despite the fact that Bret Hart screwed Hogan out of the belt, this becomes kind of more of a weird sort of story that they did where Bret Hart all of a sudden starts to align himself but not really be an official member of NWO when he helped out Hulk Hogan and attack Randy Savage, and so allowing Hulk Hogan to win the WCW title. It was really one of the early signs of where members of WCW would start aligning, or not really aligning, but start like affiliating with the NWO, but not really. And Bret Hart was kind of like the early signs of that. It didn't really make any sense as far as the way that they were handling Bret during this time. We do eventually get to the fall of '98, and by that point Sting had become a member of the NWO Wolfpack. He takes off that black and white face paint in favor of the red and black, making him look like a lobster face. And so Bret Hart starts having this so-called falling out with Hogan, starts showcasing some respect for Sting. I think there was a match that they did with Bret Hart and Hollywood Hogan. For all the times that Bret and Hogan, whether or not they were going to step toe to toe in the center of the ring. So they actually did that on an episode of Nitro, and that ended in like a no finish when it turned out that it was like all a ruse. So Sting came out looking to help Bret Hart, and then Bret turns on Sting. Bret was just kind of like fiddling with Sting's mind all along. And so eventually this intensifies. Bret Hart was the U.S. champion heading to this event. I mean, they kept turning Bret face and heel so many times, and Sting had started to lose some momentum after the world title debacle. Going into '98, he was just kind of like the third wheel behind with Kevin Nash and Hogan, and even Savage kind of became like the focal part as far as focusing more on the dissension of the NWO rather than Sting being the top guy and doing all he can to help WCW put an end to the NWO. I mean, this match wasn't bad, like I said, but I think there was just something about it that just kind of felt really off. There were a few botches here. I think the one notable, I don't know if you want to call it a botch, but Sting did a stinger splash, and then Bret moved out of the way, or supposedly, but it looked like Sting connected it. I don't know, that might have to be something to do with the camera angle. I could have sworn that Sting connected the Sting splash on the Bret, or Bret supposedly moved out of the way, Sting collided on the turnbuckle, allowing Sting to render unconscious, with Bret hitting Sting with his own baseball bat, and then locking him unconscious while applying the sharpshooter. So Bret retained the U.S. title. So medics come out there and assist Sting. I mean, this match was good, but I think for a marquee match, especially based on those two wrestlers' star powers, I think it could have been so much more. Now we get to the anticipated rematch from WrestleMania 6, only this time this is in WCW territory, that being Hulk Hogan, as billed as Hollywood Hogan at this point, taking on the Ultimate Warrior, or simply known as the Warrior. Now, what is there to be said about this match? Hogan basically got most of the offense in the beginning and even the middle of the match as well, and just basically decimating the Warrior. Now, Warrior did, however, made a triumphant debut in WCW in the August of 1998. It drew the highest rating, even beat WWE's Raw. When Warrior came in, it's like, oh wow, it's cool to see him there. And granted, he had wrestled in WWE 2 years prior to that, just a very short stint. So he comes back in '98, and he would represent WCW in the 3-team War Games match. And so that's kind of where the early seeds of Warrior and Hogan were already being planted. So it's basically a build of a 2-month feud, and we finally get this match here at '98. Even on paper, it sounded like maybe this could be a star-stealing match. I mean, I'm not saying it has to be like the traditional pure wrestling match where you have to lock up and have the best. You have to have like all these high spots, like the special attraction between two behemoths with larger than life personalities. And on paper, it sounds like this could potentially be the match that could help garner some good revenue and some potential big buy rates for the show. And then we get to the match, and there was just something about it just very off. Hogan was getting most of the offense, unlike the previous encounter where they were both baby faces. So this time Hogan's playing the heel, and Warrior's still being the face. So there's kind of more of a clash of personalities as opposed to being a battle of mutual respect. So you're gonna expect a typical Hogan match where Hogan would over rely on underhanded tactics and having to have his NWO comrades to come out there and fight his battles for him. And that happens to be the case here. The Giant would come out, and Stevie Ray, along with Vincent, would also be involved in the match, and then Warrior would just do what he does to fend them all off. And there was actually an infamous spot where Hogan used a match, and he was going to try and set Warrior's face on fire, or at least blindsiding him. And it doesn't really go the way as planned. Hogan ends up blindsiding on himself, and you could really notice some some blood that was kind of pouring on his face. It was pretty ugly there. And so they actually had to improvise. It turns out when I was researching that they did improvise. So Hogan's nephew Horace, who was just a former member of Raven's flock that had since been disbanded, would also interfere in this match. And he would use a garbage disposal to attack the Ultimate Warrior, allowing Hogan to go for the pinfall and Hogan to, successfully go over the Ultimate Warrior. In this match, I mean, it was. I actually watching this. It's so mind-boggling just to see, just how horribly executed that this match was. The Warrior was just kind of on and off again in wrestling. I mean, after leaving WWE in '91 after a falling out between him and Vince as far as money was concerned. Other than that, a couple on and off appearances, Warrior just never really regained that popularity that he had. I mean, he was, he came back in well, he didn't come back, but Warrior did make his appearance in 1998 and to a pretty big massive ovation. He really felt out of place. I think that's kind of the term that I'm looking for. Being kind of out of place at a time where you have all these more complex characters in wrestling that were kind of more cutting edge as opposed to being larger than life. And Warrior just felt like, even in '98, a wrestler that kind of was a part of his own time period, or just like there was just something about Warrior that I think he really never truly adjusted to the times like Hogan did and like Savage did during this time. So I think that was kind of a big problem. I think why the Warrior run in WCW didn't go as successful as it could have been. And a little after this, Warrior would make one more appearance on Nitro. He was basically done with WCW, and we won't see him in. We would never see him in WCW ever again, or ever wrestle in the mainstream world of wrestling. So it was definitely unfortunate that things turned out the way they did, and the match was what it was. I mean, as unfortunate as it sounds, I mean, even watching this through my eyes, rewatching the entire pay-per-view, it's just very disappointing. I just think it was too far gone at this point. It is what it is. Then we get to the main event, and this involved the WCW World Championship bout between Goldberg taking on Diamond Dallas Page. Now, this was actually a match that was actually also known for the feed. Now, the feed eventually cut off just about the instant that the match automatically began following the sound of the ring bell. So the pay-per-view feed was believed to be cut off, and you had to wait till the following night on Nitro to watch the entirety of the match. Now, eventually they did fix this in home videos, and even during the encore presentation, they did, however, manage to showcase the whole pay-per-view eventually. But when it originally aired, there was, this pay-per-view actually ran for 3.5 hours. As popular as WCW was, you could only go so far, to the point where you just drag your pay-per-views too far out. And normally when it comes to the runtime, it's at that time being 3 hours, so they couldn't really go over. And so the feed just went out. It was definitely one of the early signs of WCW as far as exposing some of their flaws as far as their management. And a lot of it had to do with how stacked the pay-per-view was, because when you count all the matches that were featured on the card, there was like over 10 matches on here. Some of those matches went on a little longer than they had every right to be. I didn't watch this pay-per-view when it originally aired, but from my perspective, if I watched the pay-per-view, if I was a viewer watching it for the very first time during its original broadcast, then I'd be pissed. I honestly would have been kind of ripped off. I would just be so bummed and disappointed and be kind of like, wait a minute, did the feed cut off? It's like, wait, I'm not, like, I can't, like, I'm not gonna watch this match. It's like, oh, I really need to see this match. Like, what's gonna happen? what? That's it? And it just ends so anticlimactic and, definitely feeling ripped off. There have been refunds also. It wouldn't surprise me if there were some people at home that were purchasing the pay per view and wanted to get a refund and give their money back. So I honestly wouldn't blame those folks that felt that same way. I mean, the match itself, actually watching this in its entirety, was actually really good. It's very hold for hold. DDP really put over this match and really played a huge part in trying to basically choreograph just how the match was going to flow out. And even though Goldberg wasn't really known for having like really, really, really long matches, even during this time, because Goldberg was mostly known for squashing people and left and right, and just putting over just how much of a built-in machine that Goldberg is. This was actually something very unique and putting him in a very challenging situation, and really showcasing that there's also other wrestlers just about his level that are really willing to give him the biggest challenge, like who could finally put an end to Goldberg. And it looked like going into this match that DDP could have been the guy to end Goldberg's undefeated streak. And he came close, unfortunately. Yeah, this match was just telegraphed really well. They told a story. The fans were really rallying behind both wrestlers, which is also another thing to make note of, because if you really, really think about it, Goldberg and Diamond Dallas Page, two of the hottest fan favorites in WCW in 1998. It didn't really involve any like bad blood or some personal heated rivalry. This was actually a match based on sportsmanship, which is what WCW was mostly emphasized on, making wrestling look like a legitimate sport. At least trying to make us, the viewers, believe that it is a legitimate sport. And this was during the time of the NWO. So a lot of the times, especially during this particular period, and interesting to note is that that this would be the first. I believe this might have been the first time that since the formation of the NWO, that that the main event did not involve any member of the NWO in any way, shape, or form, which actually makes it pretty refreshing the more I start to realize. And Goldberg and DDP were the two top figures of WCW, and these were these two baby faces that were really showcasing a sign of mutual sportsmanship. And there was actually a pretty cool spot where Goldberg tried to go for a jackhammer, and then he had a hard time lifting DDP up for it, and then he tried a second time. DDP counters and does this amazing reversal into a diamond cutter, and the crowd just ate it up. The commentators ate it up, and Tony Schiavone just putting it over. DDP looked like he was going to be the guy to potentially put an end to Goldberg's streak, and then Goldberg kicks out. Goldberg managed to regain advantage, hits DDP with the jackhammer. 1, 2, 3. Goldberg successfully retains the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. He and DDP shake hands, and that's basically how the pay-per-view ends there. So I definitely really enjoyed this match. And unfortunately, Goldberg's world title reign wouldn't last very long, and eventually dropping it to Kevin Nash under some dubious circumstances. And we all know the whole story about the finger poke-a-doo. By the time DDP would go on to win the World Heavyweight Championship, eventually he would turn heel and starts to lose a lot of the popularity that he had in 97 and 98, which was very unfortunate even looking back at that now. This was really during that time where Goldberg and DDP, the highest peak in terms of their momentum and in terms of their popularity in general. Yeah, that's basically my thoughts on Halloween Havoc 1998. So let me know what your thoughts are regarding about this pay-per-view. What were some of your favorite matches? What was your reaction if you were a viewer or at home watching this pay-per-view when it originally aired? What was your reaction when the feed may have cut off? So feel free to comment down in the comment section below. Thank you all guys for watching. And until then, this is the Gold Standard Caesar 924 signing out.